Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. Tomorrow evening in Israel, it will be Simchat Torah, and here in the U.S., we will celebrate the completion of the annual Torah cycle on Saturday night. And on Sunday, we will read V'zot HaBracha. Moses blesses all the tribes, including a reference to a legendary partnership between Zebulun and Issachar, where Zebulun engages in commerce and supports Issachar, who studies Torah. We will explore Rabbinic Judaism's various and many times conflicting positions on financial support for Torah study. So join us for Learning Torah for a Living. So, Rabbi, welcome back from the high holidays. Your major work cycle is over, and now we can just enjoy the Torah and dance the Hora.
That's it. Okay, looking forward.
So, I was kind of thinking this week as we were thinking of the beautiful Jewish celebration of Torah, which is a celebration of learning. And, this week is when they start dribbling out the Nobel Prizes. And, of course, Jews are always well represented in the Nobel Prizes. And I think that reflects on our commitment to learning and to scholarship. And on the other hand, in recent news, we hear so much of the conflict in Israel is the difference in terms of lifestyle between the secular Jews and religious Zionists who serve in the army, and because they serve in the army, they can make a living, and the Haredim, who actually want to codify this, but who believe that they should be learning all day instead of making a living. And so I think we're going to have this tension and this, we're not going to be able to take sides so much tonight as to look at both sides, because there is a beautiful aspect of supporting scholarship, whether it's Torah scholarship or just education and pure academics, and using that as an excuse to bow out of pragmatia, of the practicalities of life, and more to the case, to be supported by others. So this is a very timely discussion.
Very timely. This is a really good discussion. I'm looking forward. This is a good way to end this cycle of the Torah.
Great. So we're in Deuteronomy 33, and as I said in the intro, Moses is blessing all of the tribes. And in verse 18, he gets to a pairing, and he says, "And of Zebulun, he said, rejoice, O Zebulun, on your journeys. Samach Zebulun b'tzeitecha, and Issachar in your tents. V'Yisachar ba'ohalecha." And then he goes on. It's a very poetic blessing, sometimes a little bit hard to understand. They invite their kin to the mountain where they offer sacrifices of a tzedek, of success, it translates, for they draw from the riches of the sea and the hidden hoards of the sand. So Rashi, in his commentary, says, "Rejoice, Zebulun, in their going out, and Issachar in thy tents." Zebulun and Issachar entered into a partnership, into a shutafut. Zebulun dwelt at the harbor of ships and went out in ships to trade. He made profit and used to provide food for Issachar, who sat at home and occupied themselves with the Torah. Consequently, he mentioned Zebulun before Issachar, although the latter was the elder, because Issachar's knowledge of Torah was due to Zebulun. So maybe you could say the precipice for all of this is because he changed the birth order. But for whatever the reason, Rashi, basing himself on much older midrashim, talks about this iconic shutafut, this partnership between these two tribes, where Issachar studied in the tents. It says Yoshev Ohalim, And Zebulun went out, whether it was on the seashore or and traveled or was a trader, is not the important thing. But there was this iconic partnership, and I think a few weeks ago where we talked about this reinventing tradition, and we talked about the Haredim and the ultra Orthodox in going back 200 years have been kind of reinventing a Judaism based on almost innocuous midrashim, and the ones we cited then was that the Jews didn't change their language in Egypt, they didn't change their dress in Egypt, and they had this kind of division of labor. Well, here we have the division of labor on steroids. There it was the non-Jews are supposed to build the world, the Jews are supposed to learn Torah. Here it gets into the weeds. It says some of the Jews, Zebulun is supposed to study, Issachar is supposed to support them, but we do have this is become iconic almost, and it's built on verses that, as you always say, it's not quite there.
Right. I mean, what it really is there's a tradition of people working to support those who study Torah, and then they find the support for it in the Chumash. It's not that the Chumash says it, but they read it into the Chumash because what they need here is to have some kind of support for that approach, which is obviously what the Midrashim do all the time. And it's interesting, this is the holiday of Sukkot. The best example of that is that the Torah says on Sukkot, you take a pre-Eitz Hadar, and that's the etrog. But the Torah doesn't say etrog. It's only a rabbinic tradition that says that the pre-Eitz Hadar, the fruit of a beautiful tree, or the beautiful fruit of a tree, is an etrog. So there you have the tradition, which they then find support for in the Torah.
So what you're saying is it could very well be that this is an ancient tradition, and that the tradition, just like maybe there was a tradition that it was the etrog, and then they started to find textual sources for it. Sometimes they call it an asmachta. But here what you're saying is that we can't mistake the horse for the buggy, and that you think that there must have been a pre-existing tradition for this division of labor for scholars, and then they found some verses to put it on, which is kind of fascinating, I think. It's certainly, as I said in the introduction, something that is kind of baked into our DNA, isn't it, to support scholarship?
That's absolutely right. I mean, this is right. You use the term that you have from your days in yeshiva, which is the term asmachta. The word asmachta is just the Aramaic for the word lismo, which means to rely upon. And that means you have a tradition, to take an etrog, and you rely upon a verse. So that's what an asmachta is. And that's what all this is. There's a tradition, and we rely on the Torah, even though the Torah doesn't explicitly say it.
Great. So I should note that Ibn Ezra brings something else into the mix. When he comments on rejoice Zebulun in that going out, he says lemilchama, to war. So as if this wasn't a heated enough discussion in terms of what's going on in politics today, he actually calls a spade and says that not only did Zebulun go out and engage in trade to provide support, but they may also have gone out to wage war. And that we do have a biblical precedent for about, what was it, the 2.5 tribes who decided they didn't want to go over the Jordan. And there was a whole discussion literally in the text of the Torah about, well, you have to go and fight and then you can come back and graze your animals. So, we're going to be discussing Bereshit. We're going to start next week about how God divided between this and divided between that. This concept of separation and division of labor is also something that's very strong in Judaism. So we shouldn't be surprised that different tribes had different tasks and complexions.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's a bigger question about Mizot HaBracha, because basically what Moshe is doing is he's kind of making a prediction about the different tribes. He says, Levi, he says, he says, Levi are the ones who worked in the temple. But what's interesting is, what Moshe says to Levi is that their job is to be the teachers. And that seems to be what happened during the time of the first temple. The teachers were from Levi, because in those days it was an agricultural society. If you owned property, you needed to grow your own produce. You couldn't rely on anybody else. So the people who owned property didn't have the luxury to go out and teach. They had to hire teachers. And the people who were available were the tribe of Levi, because Levi was not allowed to own property.
Absolutely. So we have tribes. So there's clear that there were divisions, there are different blessings. I would only say that, and I always say this, that from a traditional perspective, this is a prophecy, and from a more academic, higher biblical criticism perspective, this is a description of the way it actually was later. But either way, what it's saying is, and this gets back to what you said before about a prior tradition, it seems pretty clear that there were these divisions, and that specifically with regard to study, this is something that goes back very far with the Jews. And of course, you can't mention the verses in Deuteronomy without saying also in Genesis 49, when Jacob is blessing his children, the progenitors of these tribes, he also talks about Zebulun shall dwell by the seashore in Genesis 49, and Issachar is a strong-boned ass crouching among the sheepfolds. So he makes this kind of distinction, and the commentaries, including Rashi, reference our pasuk in Deuteronomy and talk again about this distinction in this terms of this division of labor. And the midrashim all pick this up. There's a midrash Tanchuma that uses this word pragmatia, which of course is a Greek word from which we derive pragmatics, and that really highlights this distinction between those who need to be pragmatic and those who are isolated by the needs of the hour in order to think deep thoughts, so to speak. It also mentions a shutafut, which is a true partnership. There was, when I did a search on Google, I literally was blown away, Rabbi. I did not know how far this was. But there are literally published contracts that you can download off of the internet. There are dashboards where you can find, if you're a business person, you can find a scholar, and the scholar is vetted by other scholars, and you can pick your guy, so to speak. I wish you could pick your girl too, but you can pick your guy who's going to study, and you sign a contract. It's a thing. It's a real thing. And then what it talks about in the Midrash Tanchuma, it says, She'ilamale Zebulun lo asik Yisachar b'Torah. It gets back to this critical sense. It goes further than just a partnership. It gets back to why Yisachar's name was first, because without the support of Yisachar, Zebulun would not be able to do what he does. And so therefore, this contract really gives Yisachar the schut, the brownie points, the mitzvah points that Zebulun gets for learning.
That's right. I mean, that's what's interesting. The last sentence you said is the most interesting thing of all, is that the person who works gets the brownie points for learning. So it's as if he is learning because he's supporting the person who learns. Now, obviously, that is a later development. That's the way they justify the fact that people would go to work, right? You're supposed to study all day. It says, you should study Torah all day. Well, if you're going to study Torah all day, how can you go to work? So the answer is, well, if you go to work, but you support someone who studies Torah, it's as if you study Torah and you're fulfilling the mitzvah. You understand how brilliant it is?
I love it. I love it when I find Israeli authors who pick up on some of the texts that we're studying, some of the midrashim that we're studying. So in my search, I came up a story by Agnon. And it's called Issachar and Zebulun, and it's in Elu Ve'elu, which is a collection of stories that he has. And he goes to the extreme. He has Issachar arriving in Gan Eden, and Issachar being told that he's only studied 2 hours his whole life. And he goes, what are you talking about? I studied every day. He studied. And so he says, well, no, because Zebulun was supporting you, except for 2 hours he came late, or 2 days he came late in delivering your supplies. So, when we did Havdalah in the Sukkah on last Saturday night, I lit the Havdalah candle from the other candle because that's what you're traditionally supposed to do. And I told my grandchildren that we live in a world of a dog-eat-dog environment where if I win, you lose, a zero-sum environment. And there are some things in life, like love and like knowledge and like peace, that you can actually transfer it without losing. And I said that as I lit the one candle from another candle. But knowledge is certainly one of those things. But Agnon, maybe a little bit tongue-in-cheek, says, no, this is a zero-sum game. And, of course, the story ends beautifully because the two brothers are crying, where Zebulun says, I never wanted to take away your brownie points. And, of course, God bends the rules for them, and they both are now sitting up in heaven learning Torah. But again, it's the kind of this heskem, this shutafut between Zebulun and Issachar is iconic. It's known throughout the tradition. It's known through popular literature, and it is really fascinating. But now I want to kind of get into a little bit of the heated arguments that it has engendered. And I think that you need to go to two statements in Pirkei Avot that really begin the basis of much of the discussion. One is in Pirkei Avot 3:17, and it says, Im ein kemach ein Torah, im ein Torah ein kemach. If there is no bread, there is no Torah. And where there is no Torah, there is no bread. So this kind of, in a bumper sticker, talks about this relationship between study and support for that study that needs to be isolated, but you don't know quite whether that isolation is complete or does it have to be combined, because we all know of another saying which talks about Torah im derech eretz. So is it this division of labor, or is it that each person has to worry about the kemach and about the Torah? The other Pirkei Avot saying is, Rabbi Tzadok says in Pirkei Avot chapter 4, do not make a crown for self-exaltation. Don't make a tara of your Torah. Neither make a spade with which to dig. Lo karadom l'chfor bahem. And he says, anyone who derives worldly benefit from the words of the Torah removes his life from the world. So these are key Mishnaic sayings that get to the crux of the fact that this was by no means something that was taken for granted, that this type of shutafut should be pure. And we're going to look at Maimonides' commentary on these statements. But there is this healthy tension, is there not, Rabbi?
There definitely is. I want to go back to the Mishnah that says, Imein kemach ein Torah, Imein Torah ein kemach. Meaning, if you can't be supported, then you can't study Torah. I understand that. But if there's no Torah, then there's no kemach. Meaning that there's nothing in the world. If there's no Torah, then the materialism is worth nothing, because materialism is only defined in terms of Torah. That's an amazing comment. I mean, that actually is a surprising comment, right? You wouldn't guess that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I have to say, over the last few months, we've talked about this other midrash, this story about the Shtei Agalot, the two wagons. And that story is black and white. One wagon is full, and it takes precedence over the wagon that's not. And everything that we've been discussing tonight has a nuance that lacks. There's a connection between the two partners here. And God forbid you should ever forget. I think what you just brought out is that in a materialistic world, we're too quick to say, hey, if you don't bring the bread home, you're nothing. Where we can say, if you just bring home the bread, the famous saying is, man does not live on bread alone. There has to be more to life. So I think this is a much more nuanced and healthy conversation than the two wagons, and I suggest that more focus be put on this than on the other. But let's go with Maimonides' interpretation on Pirkei Avot 4:5. It's very long. I would love you to all go to the Sefaria source sheets and read it in full. It is extremely passionate. We all know that Maimonides was not only a great scholar with a capital S, but he also was a doctor. He was the court doctor, and he wrote medical books, and he paid his bills. He was, I would say, the poster child of Torah im derech eretz, of someone who didn't outsource. But it's not quite that clear. So the first thing he says is, I wasn't going to write this because most great rabbi sages would not agree. And that talks to what you were saying, Rabbi, which it's clear there was a pre-existing tradition for this shutafut, for this partnership. And he quotes the Pirkei Avot saying, do not make the Torah a tool. And he goes on to say that ultimately doing so is to make your Toratan u'manatan, to make that your source of income. He calls it a chilul Hashem. And he brings stories of rabbis who suffered poverty but would not accept anything for their scholarship. He goes on at great length to say the degree to which these rabbis never asked anything from the people and even caught themselves in instances where they were in trouble and they said, you know, I'm Rabbi so-and-so, and they benefited from their stature. He really goes on and on. It's at least 3 pages in my Sephira notes. This was something that he was extremely, extremely passionate about. And those who believe that this strict shutafut, this strict separation is not very Jewish, will use this commentary as their source. He also talks in Mishnah Torah in the laws of study, and he goes along with the very same kind of commentary. This was, I think, his main position that he came out. What we learned from it is twofold: one, how strongly he felt against it, and two, that he was the minority opinion. So this was not something that had been kind of invented in the days of Maimonides. He was going back to Talmudic sources, but he was clearly up against a very strong consensus that had developed about a clerical class, an academic class of Jews who were supported by the community to study. And it's fascinating how, this is a very, very long 2 commentaries if you look at the commentary in Avot and the Mishnah Torah. And it's striking.
So I just want to say that it is striking, and what you said is right. Of course, in Maimonides' day, everybody had to work. They had to make a living. They had to do something, right? So they couldn't afford to be studying all the time. The truth of the matter is that this clerical class that you're describing is really, it's really a function of our financial success. Because the only way you can have this class is if you have enough money in the society to support the class. If you don't have enough money, then you can't have such a class. So it's only today, Israel, they make a big deal about the fact that the Haredim want to say you don't go to work and you want to be supported. I mean, it's only because they're getting money from the government that allows them to create this class, right? I mean, it's only, if they didn't have the money, they couldn't create this class.
You're making a point that I actually had not even thought about, and that is that to accumulate capital, that's the beginning of capitalism. You don't have that if you live check to check, if you live harvest to harvest. And the only reason you need to accumulate capital is because it's not enough. It's not just for yourself. It's for others. So what you're saying, and what I've been saying till now, is that this kind of concept of this division of labor was responsible for the Jewish people's real genius for investing in scholarship and academia. I think I've been missing the other part of the story, that because there was this motivation to accumulate extra capital so that you could support those who were not working, you developed a merchant class, an entrepreneurial class that was looking to get a multiplier effect. And that too is fascinating because we Jews obviously have a knack for capitalism. I hadn't really thought about that until you mentioned the two sides.
That's why, the Haredim in Israel who need money from the government, they're not, if everybody, all the schools in Israel are supported. And if they didn't have support, so they'd have to they'd have to fundraise the way American schools fundraise, American, yeshivot fundraise. But for the Haredim, if they don't have that money, then they crumble because they're based on this society that other people need to support their way of living. We've never had such a thing before. Never in 2,000 years since the destruction of the temple have we ever had an entire group, a large group, that expects to be supported from outside. You see, it's worse than Issachar and Zebulun, because Issachar and Zebulun are this partnership. You have a feeling, and Agnon makes that point, that they're brothers, right? They get along. But here they want support for their way of life, their way of living from an outside source.
Absolutely. And I think that is such a critical point, that this is a shutafut, which means it's a partnership. And to have a partnership, you have to have two willing partners. And you can't coerce a population to support you. And that is the most basic message, I think, of what comes through here. But you talk about brothers. In the source sheet, I have quoted a portion of a letter written by Maimonides describing the death of his brother. And it's fascinating because a part of what we're discussing tonight is this magnanimous personality called Maimonides. But his brother was that trader. And his brother went down in a ship in the Indian Ocean. And it says, it was he who did business in the marketplace, earning a livelihood, while I dwelled in security. And you have to read the article. Maimonides said he couldn't leave his bed for a year. He was heartbroken. But here is a letter describing his personal relationship with his brother that flies in the face of what we just read about in his commentary, because he clearly had a partnership with his brother where he had the ability to study, and his brother was out there being a merchant. The other, I wouldn't say conflicting, because this is nuanced and it is rich, is the end in Mishnah Torah, the end of the sabbatical year in the Jubilee. And here he talks about the tribe of Levi. And he says, not only the tribe of Levi, but any one of the inhabitants of the world, kol ish ve'ish mikol bo'ei olam, whose spirit generously motivates him, and he understands with his wisdom to set himself aside and stand before God to serve him and minister him and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him, removing his neck the yoke of the many reckonings which people seek. He is sanctified as Holy of Holies. So here he talks about a scholarly class. It's beautiful that he doesn't talk about Jews. He's talking about kol ish v'ish mikol ba'oi olam. So you really do have this richness here, which makes the discussion that we're having today so, I think, so profound. But also, no one comes across a winner. But everybody who reads these verses, these midrashim, and these halachot, I think, is forced to reconsider. And maybe that's what we all need to do when we share our love for Torah. The only thing that I'll say in closing is in the sources that I bring, there are, even within the religious community, those who think that this partnership contract has gone too far. There's an article in Torah U'Masorah that says Issachar and Zebulun reinvented a symptom of the push-button Richnius. This concept, and this is how it's, I would say the word crass it's become. We're getting back to the beautiful story that we read, where people actually think that if I pay the scholar to study, I get my brownie points. And it's not that simple, because everybody has to be kve'itim leTorah, but it's this kind of almost Catholic sense of paying for one's pardon and getting brownie points. So this is something that is, on the one hand, very profound, and on the other hand, has become very pedestrian, but nonetheless fascinating and timely, and something that we can all chew on.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom. Next week from Israel, Parshat Bereshit. Looking forward.
Starting all over again. Everybody enjoy the Torah, and we'll all see you on the other side of Devarim. Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom. And here he is, my buddy Lauren. Lauren, how are you?
I have just a quick question. You get to Israel quite a bit. I think the text that you're presenting here addresses a time where there were priests and it was aristocracy, and they could pretty much carve out the scholarly pursuits, which they felt may have been an adjunct to what they were doing. How does contemporary Israeli society accept this isolation or the separation of the scholarly work? We live in a very competitive and selfish society in the United States. I'm not sure it's much different in Israel right now, except that they have a political party which is religious. So I was wondering if you could give us a take on how you feel the contemporary Israeli state, nation, accepts what we're discussing today, the separation, the need for a separation, and a perpetuation of the study of our religion.
It's a great question. There's so much there to unpack. The past president of Israel, a guy named Ruby Rivlin, made a seminal speech where he talked about the four tribes, in the current society. Obviously, they're the Arabs, and there are the Haredim, and there are the Chilonim, and there are the traditional, whether it's Mizrahim or otherwise. Israel is a unique country in that it doesn't have a majority. So it's all about tribalism. But if you go back into our history, I have argued that a lot of what happens in Bereshit, which we're going to be studying starting next week, is a rejection of a caste system. The rejection of the firstborn, of primogeniture, is the most basic rejection of the caste system. The rejection of the priests of Egypt, who owned the afterlife, with priests in Israel who couldn't own land. It's so fascinating because, yes, you have blessings, as we have in this week's Parsha, of the different tribes. So yes, we are tribal. Yes, we are divided. Yes, there are people with different skill sets and personalities. But on the other hand, we're anti-caste and anti-tribal. And I think, to answer your question, about what's happening in Israel today is they're trying to work it out because they haven't worked it out yet. Because when they established the country, unlike the U.S., where all of the discussions about how to unite these 13 different states, Israel never really had the luxury of going there, and now they have to do just that. And how do you respect the rights of one group, let's call them the Haredim, without detracting the rights of the others, of those who are engaged in this pragmatia and this pragmatics? So it's like it's the discussion that is the discussion of the day. And I think if we have any future, it's because we realize that it's a real discussion. It's not black and white. And maybe that's where, hopefully, we can, as a country and as a people, and I would throw into the mix the Jews of the exile, of the Golah, also have a piece of the cake. There are many pieces here, many of the midrashim that talk about the lulav and the etrog, which is called the arba minim, the different species in Talmudic Hebrew. Minim can also mean sectarianism. It can mean different tracts and tribes. So maybe that's the lesson of Sukkot, about all coming together in this falling sukkah under this raggedy roof. But I don't think there's an answer. I think that the question is much more important. And knowing that the question is as old as it is, and really needs still yet to be unpacked.
Is the government still in support of the religious party in terms of giving sustenance to this type of study and the pursuit of the intellectualism that it engenders?
Well, I'm not sure I would call it intellectualism. That's a whole different discussion. And I was walking that path between the study of Torah and the respect for the world of thought and scholarship. But I think to answer your question, they are respecting it, but for all the wrong reasons. Because it's a parliamentary system, to get a majority, you need to form a coalition. And the smallest part of that coalition, if it leaves, can bring down the government. And the Haredim are not even a small part. They're not small at all, and they're growing. Their average birth rate is 8 to 10 kids. So this is something that is, their power and their leverage is only going to grow. So it's a good point in time where, and I think they are looking strongly into the mirror too, because sometimes if you ask for too much, you don't get anything. So I think the government takes them very seriously, but when the holiday is over and they come back to the Knesset, the first thing on the agenda is not judicial reform. The Haredim said we joined this party because we joined this coalition because we want it to be legislated in law that if you study Torah, you don't have to go to the army. If we don't get that law, we're going to leave the government. So the government could fall over exactly this issue. And for that reason and that reason, it only does the government take this seriously. The real issues, if you ask me about the Haredim, is what they're studying. They should have secular education as well. They should learn math. They should. The last Maimonides quote that we had was talking about B'nai Olam, people of the world. He was talking about real study, real philosophy, academia, progress, and that I think they have a very laser focus on just one aspect of Torah. But anyway, that's for another discussion. But yes, they are taken very seriously, but for the wrong reasons.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. See you all next week.